So let's get back to our warm-up. And it starts, yeah, there's this cat here. The cat actually was labeled. I had to take this in the Photoshop and get rid of the labels, or else it gave away a lot of the answers, actually. So it was a little tricky to have a picture of a cat with lymphatics, but not give away the answers. So major lymph vessel that is going to drain the upper right-hand part of the body.
Right lymphatic duct.
Yeah, so it's just, so that one is pretty straightforward. It's just going to be, what if I had said, name the major lymph vessel that drains the upper right part of the body and all of the bottom of the body?
Thoracic.
That'd be the thoracic duct. And like I mentioned, for our class, those are the only two major lymph vessels that you are responsible for. There are other lymph vessels that have names, but those are the two that you need to know for our class. Next, we go, I love this picture. This is this beautiful cross-section of the ileum, the lower part of the small intestine. And it says, name the structures that are lying below the mucosa here. These, I said indicated, shown by the box, but so these purple dealies, what are they?
Peyer's patch.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of things you could have said there. You could have said Peyer's patches. Peyer's patches. You could have also said they're, lymphoid nodules. You could have said they're lymphoid follicles.
Aggregated lymphoid follicle.
Yeah, aggregated lymphoid follicles, that would work great. You could say MALT. You could say, it's mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. Those would all be appropriate answers. And then the next part was, what kind of cells make up these structures?
Lymphoid nodules.
So they are lymphoid nodules, but cells, so cell types. What kind of cells do we find in these lymphoid nodules?
Lymphocytes?
Yeah, totally, lymphocytes. Lymphocytes, and in that tissue, in that lymphoid tissue, there's also macrophages. But so if you just wrote lymphocytes, that's great. If you wrote lymphocytes and macrophages, that's great. In particular, these nodules are particularly like B cells. You could say B lymphocytes or B cells. So there's lots of right answers there. The function of the spleen.
To filter blood.
It basically filters blood. It is a big part of what it's doing. Somebody, I was grading some of these. Well, there's like some clicking that's. Somebody said the function is to recycle worn out red blood cells, and I gave them like 0.175 because it does. That's a major job it does, but it does other things too. So it's filtering blood, and it can do other things. I mentioned it can actually be like a reservoir to like push blood back into circulation if you're hemorrhaging or something.
I wrote it destroys bloodborne antigens and destroy the old destroyed.
Yeah, I think I gave you full
blood
credit
cells.
for that.
Okay.
So function of the spleen. Tonsils. What are tonsils and where are they located? So, what are they?
Lymphoid organ.
Yeah, again, they're aggregations of lymphoid tissue again, or they're they're the MALT again, or, just lymphoid tissue under the, under the skin, around the throat. There's no one right answer. And then major locations. There's three main aggregations of this lymphatic tissue that we talked about.
auxiliary, cervical, and inguinal.
So that is not, that was major places where you have lymph nodes, but the tonsils are around your throat.
Palatine,
Palatine, when
pharyngeal,
Yeah, so
lingual.
there were the pharyngeal tonsils, which are the ones kind of right up on the back of your nasopharynx, also called the adenoids. There were the lingual, which is at the base of the tongue. And then the palatine, which were on the soft palate, kind of on either side of your uvula. Those are the main. Question 5 is going to the other thing. It says, pick the 3 regions with the greatest concentration of superficial lymph nodes. And there, so now you can say that again.
Yeah, sorry, I was answering the wrong question. Cervical, auxiliary, and inguinal.
Yeah, cervical, axillary, and inguinal. Yeah, so in the groin region, in the neck region, in the axillary region, and there are more. There are other places where there are concentrations, but these are like the 3 most apparent. So submit quiz. Wait, oh, did I? Oh, I didn't, blah, blah, blah. All right, so that was the quiz, the warm up. And other orders of business. Let me go back into, where's my sharing thing? There it is. I'm going to stop sharing. So we had a department meeting yesterday and we were talking about lots of things. And one of the things that came up was about administering tests using the Proctorio system. And basically everybody's doing it, and the recommendation is to use that system. So we are going to be using it for our test on Tuesday. I'll talk more about it when we get to lab. Actually, part of lab today is going to be kind of a test run of Proctorio on your computers. It's basically a way of trying to be more secure about administering online tests. So it's an extension that adds into Chrome. You have to run the exam in Chrome, and then it kind of stops you from opening new windows. It makes it so you can't copy and paste things. It basically does the things so it tries to make the test taking more secure. It won't let you open up like a new window so you can't like Google something. That's that kind of thing. And again, it is now the best practices so I am going to use it. When you install it, it's a little weird. It says like, it has access to blah, blah, everything, but it's just an extension. You can install it and then disable it when you're not using it, and you'll just have to enable it before you take an exam, and then you can disable it again. And what else about Proctorio? I'll talk more about it. The other thing is you do need to have a laptop and a camera. And I know some people were working without those. So right now, is there anybody who does not have a laptop with a camera on it?
I don't have a camera still. It got delayed, so I have to figure out a way to get one. I know I can pull it up on my phone, but I don't know if that's kosher.
It's not. So what I'm going to do, this also came up in the ComCares meeting or our department meeting. If I fill out a report in ComCares, they seem to be doing some magic to make sure anybody who does not have laptops and cameras to do this will get set up. Hopefully the turnaround, this is Thursday, hopefully the turnaround's quick enough. So Chris, do you know what time your webcam is supposed to arrive?
It was supposed to be this week, but it got delayed until June.
To June, oh my God. All right, that's definitely something we're gonna have to deal with.
I was also working with my phone camera, I like tried to fix my camera on my computer and it worked for like a second and then it stopped working again. So I don't know what's wrong with it.
So maybe, so Nikki, stay maybe during break. I don't want to like have this big discussion now, but when we break for a few moments, stay on, and then I can see if I can get some insight into what's going on there.
Okay, great.
All right. Anybody else who is going to have technology issues running this thing? Because we have to make sure everybody's got the proper technology by Tuesday. Okay. So then we're going to continue. One of the nice things, like compared in my physiology class, we're pretty behind, but in anatomy class, we're actually keeping up. I think it's because we're not doing labs so much. So it means we have more time to keep covering material. And actually I did I sent an email or an announcement to everybody, but I did manage to get Pearson assignments up for blood vessels and for the blood. And you should definitely get those done over the weekend. They cover the material, or a lot of material, that you will be responsible for the exam. So there'll be good reviews, good kind of check-ins to see if you know the stuff. Again, apologize, it's taken me a little while to get them. It literally, it's like for each one I go through like a couple of hundred questions and double check that the answer, because there's been reports that some of the answers on them are actually not right. So I double check that I do it and it all has the right answers. So it takes way longer than I was hoping.
Professor, a question for you about the format of the exam list. Are you going to talk about that later, or can I ask you about it?
No, yeah. Go for it.
I just was wondering, because when we were taking it in person, it was a pretty huge chunk of time, and curious, just like orienting myself to prepare for how long you're thinking about how long it might be when we're taking it on Tuesday.
My plan is to have both sections be, somewhere around like, an hour to hour and a half or something. So, I mean, the lecture one will be similar to what the lecture one was always. The lab one obviously is going to be super different. It's not going to be a timed lab practical. I'm going to have to use kind of my instinct to some degree to figure out how much time it's going to take. And you guys can give me feedback when we're done, and I can use that for the next exam. But
okay.
I literally have never done anything like this online lab practical. So it's hard for me to know exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, that's helpful. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay. So again, your exam is going to be on just nervous system and cardiovascular, but we're going to continue with new material. Again, we did lymphatic last time. We're going to do the endocrine system today.
I have a question. So for the next exam, do we need to download that Chrome extension?
Yes.
Okay.
And in fact, during break, so I've been spending time this morning kind of just trying to figure out the details. I'm going to make a little test exam, and during lab today, we're going to just together try to do a little test exam in that thing and see, or for the people who currently do have the technology, just to see what it feels like, to see what kind of hiccups arise, so we can like work out the bugs before the main exam happens.
What is it called again?
It's called Proctorio.
Proctorio.
And I enabled it in Canvas. I think if you click on it in Canvas, it takes you, as long as you're in Chrome, it will take you to the download place for the add-on. It's a little, I mean, Google's got a good deal. Basically, you can't run it unless you're running Chrome. I can't actually edit my tests in Proctorio unless I'm running in Chrome. So they're kind of like, oh, use Chrome. All right. But Google does a lot of good stuff. All right. Let us introduce the endocrine system. So we already know from the first week or two of class what endocrine glands do. What does it mean to be an endocrine gland? Versus an exocrine gland.
Basically to a bloodstream.
Exactly. So it's the idea of the ductless, right? Remember the ductless glands? There's no ducts. They make some kind of secretion, which then typically gets absorbed into the bloodstream and distributed that way. Endocrines, so the hormones, so that's what, hormones are just these signaling molecules. That are distributed by the bloodstream. And once again, we saw that with adrenaline, epinephrine. And once it's in the bloodstream, any cell in your body that has the appropriate receptor that recognizes will be able to respond. One of the things that is important to know is endocrine glands that are obviously part of the endocrine system, like the thyroid and the adrenal glands and stuff like that. But there are also a lot of other organs that are not primary endocrine glands that use hormones to help coordinate things in your body. Your digestive tract, for instance. When we get to the digestive system, we'll actually meet a number of hormones that are secreted by the stomach and by the small intestine. In fact, that's where hormones were first discovered, was trying to understand how the small intestine was controlling activity of the pancreas. So hormones are not just about, the formal glands that you're more used to. Your heart actually secretes hormones. If your atria are too stretched out, though, your heart will release a hormone to try to lower your blood pressure. So just kind of putting that out there. We are going to focus on the more formal cast of characters, again, the pituitary gland and the adrenal gland and all that. But hormones are used by other organs as well to signal and to control and all that. So let's talk about a little more about hormones. There's two main types, and it's worth kind of knowing why they're different. There's basically steroid hormones, and these are derived from cholesterol. And then there are amino acid based. Some of these amino acid based are, like adrenaline is basically kind of a modified version of amino acids. Other hormones like insulin are 37 amino acids connected together. And so some hormones are actually peptides, like strings of amino acids. Other ones are modified versions of amino acids. But the big difference here is steroid hormones. These are lipids. These are derived from cholesterol, which is kind of related to fat. So these are not soluble in water. or maybe I should say fat soluble, or I'll say lipophilic. They like fats, but they don't dissolve in water. Whereas these guys here, these are hydrophilic. These will dissolve in water. So amino acid-based hormones, you can just dump into the bloodstream. They dissolve in the plasma. They move around. When they find some cell, let's say this is my target cell. There's going to be some receptor on here. Some receptor for the hormone. The hormone itself kind of goes in, hormone binds to the receptor. So most of these amino acid-based ones, they dissolve in water, or I should say they dissolve in the plasma. They drift around. They can then be recognized by receptors right on the surface of the target cell. Steroid hormones, on the other hand, need special carriers in order to move through the bloodstream. I talked about this when we were talking about the blood, the plasma proteins. So these are going to need to bind to proteins so that that complex can actually dissolve and flow around in the bloodstream. Otherwise, it would be like trying to put little oil drops, in water. They don't mix nice. When they actually get to the target cell, let's say this is my target cell. Because they are actually fat soluble, lipophilic, they can actually drift right through the membrane. The membrane is basically, it's a phospholipid. It's basically a fatty kind of molecule. It can actually drift right through the nuclear envelope. And the receptors for these hormones, these steroid hormones, are often actually in the nucleus of the cell. So they're more likely to turn on or off protein transcription or cell regulation or things like that. So steroid hormones actually have receptors in the nucleus of the cell. Whereas these amino acid-based ones, the receptors are here on the cell membrane, on the outside of the cell. So that's a big difference. That's what we'll say for that. A few more kind of big picture things before we get into the details of the individual hormones, or glands, I should say, or hormones and glands. Control of hormone release. So what kind of things will actually trigger the release of hormones by an endocrine gland?
Physiologic changes?
Yeah, so one thing is just kind of the environmental milieu, like if your sugar levels are going up or down, or if calcium levels are going up or down. So one, it can just be kind of, environmental factors. I should say internal environmental factors. Like glucose levels, calcium, etc. Right, so just the if you have glucose going up in your bloodstream, that's going to trigger the release of insulin, which tells cells that there's sugar to take up. If your sugar levels are dropping, you're going to release glucagon, for instance, to tell your liver to release stored carbohydrate to bring your sugar back up. So sometimes hormones are controlled by just environmental factors in your body. What's another way you can control the release of hormones? We saw in the sympathetic, we looked at the sympathetic nervous system. What triggers the release of adrenaline or epinephrine?
Epinephrine.
Say it again.
Epinephrine.
So what triggers the release of epinephrine?
Fight or flight response.
So, and that is a more specific part of the bigger picture.
Stress.
I'm thinking more just like your nervous system. So you can have sometimes glands are triggered to secrete because they're actually just triggered by the nervous system. So like the adrenal gland is triggered by the sympathetic nervous system to release epinephrine. And then a really big part of hormone control is actually hormones that control other hormones. So we call them tropic hormones. So basically a tropic hormone and sometimes there's multiple levels of this. We're going to see, there's gonadotropin releasing hormone causes the release of luteinizing hormone, which causes the release of testosterone. And then there's feedback loops and this and that. So this is going to be really common, this idea of tropic hormones, where you have one hormone that then will talk to some other gland and tell it to release some other hormone. So we'll see a bunch of those. All right, so then now what we're going to do for the rest of today is just look at what the, oh, I'm sorry, is this, so we're gonna now look at just the basic major glands and what hormones they release. I will give you another homework assignment at the end of class today. It's not gonna be due until after the exam, so don't worry about that. But what it's going to be is basically going down all the major glands and just talking about what are the main hormones released by each of those glands, and in a nutshell, what is the function of those hormones. So we're going to talk about that formally today. And then there'll also be, just kind of a short homework assignment just to make you kind of go and kind of more rigorously kind of look at each one and make sure you've got it all organized. We're also going to talk about the histology. A lot of the glands have really kind of cool microscopic structures, and we'll go over some of that in the lab part today. Okay. So if we might as well start with kind of the gland that's often known as kind of the master gland. What is the gland we already talked about when we're doing the nervous system that we already said controls lots of other glands?
The pituitary gland?
The pituitary. So we are gonna dig into the pituitary gland, but to talk about the pituitary, we need to talk about the hypothalamus. And then hanging off of the hypothalamus, there's this little thing called the infundibulum. And then there's the pituitary gland. There's more than two, but there's two main sections of the pituitary. There's the posterior pituitary. This is also known as the neurohypophysis, aka neurohypophysis. The word hypophysis is another synonym for pituitary gland. So when you see the word hypophysis, it means pituitary gland. This other side is going to be the anterior pituitary. AKA the adenohypophysis. So hypophysis, again, sometimes rather than calling the pituitary gland, you could just call it hypophysis. Posterior pituitary, anterior pituitary. There's other names for these. You can call the posterior pituitary also like the pars nervosa, and this these are the two names that you'll be held accountable for here. The either posterior pituitary, also known as neurohypophysis, and anterior pituitary, also known as adenohypophysis. As you can kind of get from its name, neurohypophysis, the posterior pituitary is actually derived from nervous tissue. It's actually, there are neurons in the hypothalamus that send axons all the way down to here. And basically, as those axons fire and release stuff, that's actually what is releasing the hormone. So under the microscope, this posterior pituitary looks very different from the other part because it's basically like axons. So posterior pituitary derived from these neurons that are coming from the hypothalamus. The anterior pituitary is very different. The anterior pituitary is derived from epithelial tissue like more common glands. So under the microscope, it looks kind of like a bunch of really dense little cells everywhere. And this is controlled by tropic hormones from the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is going to release these hormones. They're called releasing hormones. So hypothalamus releases, I wish. So these releasing hormones, they have different names, usually something tropin releasing hormone. You don't need to know the names of all of them. There's only one that we're gonna talk about explicitly when we get to the reproductive system. So this includes gonadotropin releasing hormone, which we'll talk about later. So you will need to know one of these in particular by name, but not until we get to the reproductive system. For right now, let's just put it out there that the hypothalamus is releasing these quote unquote releasing hormones that control the pituitary anterior part. Hormones get delivered by the bloodstream. In order to have a really direct communication between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, there is actually this special system of blood vessels. So in the hypothalamus, we're going to have a capillary bed. And it's going to come down here, and there's going to be a capillary bed number 2 down here. So we can have these releasing hormones can get absorbed into this capillary bed here in the hypothalamus and go a very short distance and then get delivered via the capillary bed number 2 down here in the pituitary. Does anybody remember what we call a system like this in circulation where you have one capillary bed feeding a second capillary bed?
Hepatic portal system.
Right, so hepatic portal system was the portal system for the liver. And since this is in the hypophysis, this is what we're going to call the hypophyseal portal system. So hepatic portal system was the one, in fact, it's a good review. Where is the first capillary bed in the hepatic portal system?
Digestive viscera.
Yeah, exactly. In the digestive organs, the digestive viscera, where they can pick up nutrients. And then where is the second one, the second capillary bed?
Liver.
Yeah, in the liver. So those things can get processed in the sinusoids within the liver before getting dumped in the general circulation. So this is the hypophyseal portal system, which is basically allowing this really kind of direct delivery of releasing hormones from the hypothalamus down to the anterior pituitary. Before we leave this picture here, where is this little, there's a little like, nice little like pocket, little saddle where the pituitary gland sits under the brain inside the floor of the skull. Do you remember what that is? Anybody?
Sella turcica?
Exactly, that's the sella turcica. There's actually another, we talked about all these dural membranes. There is one of these dural septa that kind of goes around that. It's called the diaphragma sellae. It's part of the reason why none of our brains actually have the pituitary gland hanging off of the hypothalamus. Basically, when you're trying to take the brain out of the skull, maybe I could do this on a, right, here's the brain. Here's the pituitary gland, here's the skull, and here's sitting in this little thing. There's this dural septa that just kind of anchors right around this. So if you are trying to pull the brain out, by the time you've got enough access to kind of trim this thing's already ripped off. So unless you're gonna like do some fancy chiseling away of all the skull and free everything up, you're pretty much gonna rip off the pituitary gland as you try to pull the brain out of the skull. So in case, I don't know if in case you're wondering, none of the brains we saw when we still had the ability to handle actual real stuff had pituitary glands hanging off of the hypothalamus, but that's just because they were ripped off. Okay. Now what we're going to do is go through the different hormones that we're going to find being released by the posterior pituitary. Versus anterior pituitary. And we can start with the posterior pituitary because there's only two instead of a bunch. One of them is ADH, also called antidiuretic hormone. Also called vasopressin. Just from its name, what do you think it does?
Makes you retain water.
It helps you retain water. Okay, anti-diuretic means against peeing. So we're going to talk about ADH in more detail when we talk about the urinary system. But for right now, you could just know that ADH talks to the kidneys and tells it to conserve water. If you're drinking alcohol, alcohol suppresses the release of ADH, which means you're going to pee more, which most people here have probably experienced in their life. It's also called vasopressin because your water levels actually play an important role in your blood pressure. If you're trying to keep your blood pressure up, you actually want to keep your blood volume higher, which means you want to keep the water in your body rather than peeing it out. ADH also constricts blood vessels, which also puts your blood pressure up. So ADH is about water balance, but it also plays an important role in regulating blood pressure as well. Oxytocin. So oxytocin, this one, sometimes people think of it like the cuddle hormone or something. This one is released, it's actually released like after you orgasm, and that kind of warm, fuzzy, connected feeling there. It's implicated in all sorts of nurturing behaviors and social bonding behaviors. And it's actually like when people like the research I've been doing with MDMA is implicated as one of the mechanisms of why MDMA is useful as a therapeutic adjunct. MDMA seems to cause the release of more oxytocin. And so people who are in their therapy and they have elevated levels of oxytocin feel safer, feel more held, and feel more able to kind of go into difficult material. So oxytocin, and if you look at a lot of different non-human mammals even, they all have kind of, oxytocin connected to social bonding. They've actually done studies like with dogs and humans where a dog and a human who lock gaze and look at each other, they have mutual releases of oxytocin. So it's kind of hilarious. So both of them are going, I feel connected to you. At least at this hormonal level. Oxytocin also plays some roles in pregnancy. Oxytocin is what triggers uterine contractions. So like when you're going into labor, you're getting higher and higher levels of oxytocin, which are squeezing harder and harder, trying to pop the baby out. Oxytocin also causes milk letdown, meaning causes the mammary glands to squirt out milk. So oxytocin is kind of social bonding, nurturing, uterine contractions. If somebody is not, is late and they want to induce delivery, they give them a shot of tocin, a shot of oxytocin, basically, to induce labor. So oxytocin. So that's the posterior pituitary, anterior pituitary. It's going to have a bunch more. A lot of the ones that are in the anterior pituitary are tropic hormones. So hormones that control the release of other hormones. So let's meet our cast of tropic hormones. One of them is called ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone. What do you think it talks to? Who do you think it controls?
The adrenal gland.
Yeah, the adrenal gland. And in particular, it controls the adrenal cortex. We're going to talk about the adrenal gland in more detail in a few moments, but basically the adrenal medulla was what makes adrenaline. That's the part controlled by the sympathetic nervous system, but the outer part makes these different steroid hormones, and that's controlled by ACTH. Another tropic hormone released by the anterior pituitary, TSH. Thyroid stimulating hormone. And it's like, no duh, it controls the thyroid gland. So thyroid stimulating hormone is going to tell the thyroid gland to up production of thyroid hormone. And again, we'll talk more about what the thyroid gland is doing when we get there. The next ones, there's going to be actually two gonadotropins. So gonadotropins are going to be tropic hormones that control obviously the gonads. So of the gonadotropins, first there's going to be follicle stimulating hormone. Which is called FSH, is its normal name. And then the other one is going to be luteinizing hormone. Often known as LH. Obviously, these are going to do different things if they're released in a guy versus a woman. Again, gonads. Gonads are the testes in a guy, the ovaries in a woman. So let us take a look for follicle stimulating hormone. So in the female, this promotes development of the follicle. So, what is a follicle? We're going to talk way more about this later. Like if this is the ovary, the eggs are never alone. The eggs are always going to be surrounded by lots of other cells in these more complicated structures. So, the ova ovum is just one part of this thing, but then there's lots of other cells that are part of the system as well. The overall structure is the follicle, which contains the ovum. So the egg is never alone. Even after it's ovulated, it's still going to be surrounded by a bunch of different cells. So the follicle is going to be the ovum plus a bunch of other cells making a more complicated structure. Again, at the end, when we get into the reproductive system, we'll talk all about follicular development and primordial follicle versus primary follicles versus secondary versus Graafian follicles and all that. But for right now, just saying, when FSH is released, it's going to promote the development of this follicle in the egg, which is going to ultimately be what's ovulated. All right, back to here. No, not there. Back to here. If we look in the guy, what is it probably going to do? If in a woman, it's developing the structure containing the egg.
Can it develop the sperm in the test tube?
Exactly. Exactly. So this is going to promote sperm development. Again, little sperm. We'll talk way more about them as well when we get to the reproductive system. So that is follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. You know, it is what is kind of going up at the beginning of a woman's monthly cycle as she's starting to develop the new egg, getting it ready to ovulate. At the middle of the cycle, around day 14, there is a big surge in luteinizing hormone. And this is what triggers ovulation. So like the first couple of weeks, FSH is up and this follicle is developing, getting ready. And then at like around day 14, there's a big surge in luteinizing hormone and the egg pops out and is released into the fallopian tubes and all that. Again, we're going to look at all that in way more detail when we get to the reproductive system. But for right now, this is kind of your introduction to these hormones. In the guy, luteinizing hormone promotes the development of testosterone. Yeah, and we'll talk more. Triggering ovulation, and it also, luteinizing hormone is going to trigger the development of the corpus luteum, which makes progesterone. So, but don't worry about that right now. We'll talk about all that in way more detail. All right, so tropic hormones from the anterior pituitary. We have ACTH controlling the adrenal cortex, TSH controlling the thyroid stimulating hormone, these two different gonadotropins, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And again, remember I'm mentioning that these are all controlled by the hypothalamus. You know, back up here, like the hypothalamus, like for instance, is releasing gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is causing these to be released. And then these are causing testosterone and estrogen to get released and all that. So you can see there can be many levels of this control. The gonadotropin releasing hormone, talking to these, we'll look at that when we look at the reproductive system. So there are a couple of other anterior pituitary hormones, which I'm going to erase this stuff so then I can just, maybe I'll just go onto a new page. So there's ACTH, there's TSH, there's FSH, there's LH. These are the ones we just talked about. These are all tropic hormones. There's also growth hormone. GH, which is what it sounds like. It actually promotes, growth of, muscle mass and all sorts. You need a certain amount of this to kind of maintain your tissues and all that. But if you have too much, it causes overgrowth of things and problems, or not enough, it also causes problems. This is actually a good place to introduce like the idea of most of the pathologies that have to do with the endocrine system have to do with either hypo or hypersecretion, right? Hyposecretion means you're not secreting enough. hypersecretion, meaning you're secreting too much. If you have a hyposecretion of growth hormone, particularly when you're still growing, like you're still like young, or you're not in your 20s yet, you end up being really small. You get what's called pituitary dwarfism. So it's not like the dwarfism like the, what's his name, the Lannister dude from Game of Thrones, who's just like kind of that kind of where you're short but your body proportions are different. If you have a hyposecretion of growth hormone and you get pituitary dwarfism, your proportions are like normal, but you're just really small. Hypersecretion, you can get pituitary gigantism, get people who are 7 feet and taller, to so large if you don't control it that they actually can't even support their own weight anymore. So it can also be really, really bad situation. So growth hormone. If you get too much growth hormone when you are already past where your long bones have stopped growing, remember the epiphyseal plates close off like around 20s or so, the flat bones can actually still keep growing. So people who have hypersecretion of growth hormone post the closing of the epiphyseal plates, they don't get taller, but their flat bones, like in their face, start growing and spreading out, and they get these weird flattened features and stuff, which you can actually see on some of these, like, sports players who do, the kind of the illegal doping where they'll take growth hormone because it will give them much bulkier muscles and stuff, but it also kind of makes their facial features look way more coarse and strange and all that. So yes, you will be stronger and probably hit the ball farther if you take it, but you'll also like look weird. And I think there's other reasons you don't want to do it. Prolactin. Promotes lactation. So typically the mammary glands are inactive. Obviously, during pregnancy, they have to get primed and wake up and ready to go. And that's part of this job here. So anterior, so that's the pituitary. And you can kind of come back. Again, hypothalamus ultimately is doing a lot of the control. And because of that, this is where the nervous system actually is very tied into the functioning of your endocrine system. Hypothalamus releasing hormones, which talk to the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary is controlling your adrenal glands. So being stressed, like right now, I'd be like kind of shocked if anybody here is not pretty freaking stressed. That mental state causes the hypothalamus to talk to your pituitary to release, the ACTH, talks to your adrenal gland to release like cortisol, one of the main stress hormones. Kind of prepares, shifts your body to deal with emergencies, but also tends to like depress your immune system and things because you put your resources into making lots of energy available and put long-term health and healing more on the back burner. So it's a good reason to whatever things you have at your disposal to try to not be as stressed in this time is probably a good thing health-wise, because the control of your brain talking to your pituitary, talking to your adrenal glands actually can suppress your immune system and things like that. So continuing on. All right, so this, in simpler times when our little subjects still remembered how to smile. And we've got Lydia coming down. Oh, she should have, there's the larynx. Larynx is your voice box. Actually, it should be a little lower, shouldn't be. It's like your Adam's apple. Like with, it's the thing I'm touching here to make my voice do that cool vibrato thing. My larynx, my voice box. Coming down below that is going to be my trachea, the windpipe. Just below the larynx, you know, sometimes people talk like a little bow tie. You have the thyroid gland. It's got one lobe on either side, and then this little, they think they call it the isthmus, a little thing that goes across. So it's sitting there, and it releases thyroid hormone. So there's different names. It can be thyroid hormone, also called thyroxine. And thyroxine is actually kind of a more collective term for these things. One is called T3, which is triiodothyronine, and T4, which is tetra. Tetra is just for iodothyronine. You know, you do not have to remember triiodothyronine or tetraiodothyronine. The reason why I am writing it out formally, though, is because I want you to think about iodo. So these need iodine. So that is important to know. You need iodine to make the thyroid hormone. It also means the thyroid gland really concentrates iodine. It concentrates iodine like a couple of 100 times greater than the rest of your body. You know, and so it's actually one of the ways, if you want to non-surgically get rid of somebody's thyroid, if they have like hyperthyroid or something, you can actually give them radioactive iodine. Which has a half-life that's only like a couple of weeks, so it goes away pretty quick. And you do it at a lower dose, so most of the tissues don't get too high of a radiation dose, but the thyroid gland is concentrating it, and that gets zapped. So you can use radioactive iodine to actually kill off somebody's thyroid. You know, it's also why, like, I don't know if you remember when there's those nuclear reactor accidents where all these radioactive isotopes get poofed out into the air. You know, people nearby, they say, take iodine tablets. You know, the idea there is max out your thyroid gland's iodine before you actually get exposed to the radioactive iodine. So then your thyroid gland isn't going to take up that radioactive iodine and get killed accidentally from the kind of radioactive cloud from the Billiken reactor. Anyway, what does thyroid hormone do?
It regulates like how your body breaks down food and like uses it for energy.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of adjusting your kind of metabolic rate and how fast you're breaking things down, how much energy is being released and used. People who are hypothyroid, not enough thyroid hormone, tend to be slower, tend to gain weight. People who are hyperthyroid tend to get really kind of jumpy Um, one of my colleagues who was hyperthyroid, he realized he was hyperthyroid because he started like skipping. He would be writing on the board and all of a sudden he'd realize he's on the next word and hasn't even finished writing the last word he was trying to write. And he was just, everything was going so fast, he was kind of skipping forward and things. People who are hyperthyroid also get this thing called exophthalmosis, which is where your eyes bulge out. I'm not actually sure exactly what the whole mechanism is, why that happens, but it's like the classic, the Marty Feldman eyes, that comes from hyperthyroidism. So I think your book has some pictures. I can show them to you a little later. You know, there's different things. People can get, it's actually quite common to have this autoimmune disease where your immune system attacks your thyroid gland. It's called Hashimoto's syndrome, where you become hypothyroid because your own immune system is hurting your thyroid gland, in which case you need to take synthetic, they call it like Synthroid, the synthetic hormone to kind of keep your levels up. Thyroid gland also releases one other hormone. Calcitonin helps you absorb and store calcium. So that is the thyroid gland.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So this whole thing that is this going to be on the test for next week?
No, remember I said only the nervous system and the cardiovascular system. So
Okay,
this is going to be on the last test. So let's see. I want to, before we leave the thyroid gland, I'm going to go into the histology very briefly. Let's get it out of that card. So the thyroid gland is actually the only gland that stores its hormone outside of the cells. Most glands do their secretion kind of the way you would imagine, right? They make stuff and it's in little vesicles and then they dump it out where it gets absorbed into the bloodstream. You know, kind of thyroid gland, I'll show you pictures of it. It's actually really pretty. You have these big, they're kind of like reservoirs. So we have these cells. And they make these kind of big bubbles. So these cells are called T thyrocytes. These are the things that are making the thyroid hormone, but it gets stored inside these big things called follicles. So these follicles are filled with this stuff called colloid, which binds the thyroid hormone. So this is going to be, you know, under the microscope, they're pretty cool looking. There are also obviously we need some cells to make the calcitonin, and those are found in the spaces in between. So outside are these things called C thyrocytes that make calcitonin. So that's our little histology of the thyroid gland. Again, I will show you when we do the lab part, I'll show you real pictures of them. And back. So thyroid gland, sitting in little islands on top of the thyroid gland is another gland that is called the parathyroid gland. There's actually little, so it's on the back of the thyroid. I'm going to draw it on the front because otherwise I can't draw it on the back. But they're basically these little pockets on the thyroid gland. And these release this parathyroid hormone. Which basically, so this parathyroid hormone, what cell do you think, first, where is calcium stored in your body?
Your bones.
Exactly. So what cell is going to have the receptors for parathyroid hormone? What cell is going to be able to dissolve the bone matrix and release the calcium into your body?
Osteoclast.
Exactly, osteoclasts. So parathyroid hormone is talking to osteoclasts. The way people found out about the parathyroid hormone is actually kind of tragic. People would have hyperthyroid, and a way to deal with hyperthyroid is you surgically take out the thyroid. And what they found was that it would help with the hyperthyroidism, but then they would have these really horrible mineral imbalances. So they're like, oh, we did something we didn't realize we were doing. They actually had taken out the parathyroid glands as well, because they didn't realize that they are just sitting in little pockets here on top of the thyroid gland. So again, the thyroid gland and the parathyroid gland are different. They're their own separate, unique things, but they are kind of co-located together. Parathyroid glands are sitting in little encapsulated islands underneath the backside of the thyroid gland. So, all righty. Endocrine continued. So we did pituitary, which is the big daddy rabbit of all the glands. That's the, we've made it through that. Now we did the thyroid and parathyroid. We just got a few more glands to cover here. So let's do the pancreas. Gosh. Before we talk about the pancreas, I am going to do a little tangent, because in order to describe the location of the pancreas, we actually need to use a word that we haven't really used yet. When we talk about the pancreas is retroperitoneal. And it's like, what does that mean? So let's talk about retroperitoneal and the peritoneum in general. So here is person, big butt, whatever. So we have the abdominal cavity, thoracic cavity, diaphragm. We talked about how the heart is in the pericardium. You know, the lungs are in the pleura, right? Remember, there's a pericardium, the pleura. So these, again, the serous membranes that surround the things and let them be able to move around without rubbing. Now what we're going to do is get deeper in. We've already mentioned, what's the name of the serous membrane that surrounds your digestive organs?
Mucosa.
Peritoneum.
Say it again, Elsa.
Peritoneum.
Exactly.
Peritoneum.
Yeah, the peritoneum. So the mucosa is the lining. It's the inside of the tube. But all of the organs are all wrapped in this serous membrane called the peritoneum. And the best way to think about the peritoneum, people often think, like, imagine you have a balloon and then you like kind of stick your fist in the balloon and then the balloon starts kind of wrapping around your fist. And then if we take it all the way, so this is how we can really think about the peritoneum. The peritoneum is, maybe I'll use green, I'll use blue. The peritoneum is here and it's lining the inside of your abdominal cavity here. And then the stuff that is coming into it, like your stomach and your intestines and all these things, they're all kind of pooching into this thing and it kind of goes around them all. So each of these pieces, like if I look at, you know, this little section in magnification, it's going to look like this. It's like here is like a cross section of my intestine. And here is this kind of layer of the peritoneum, the serous membrane. It wraps around the actual thing and then it comes back down. So this is kind of like a cross section of your intestine. And you can see that your intestines, it's not like just putting like a 20-foot snake and shoving it inside your belly. It's actually hanging off of the back of your wall here by this double layer of serous membrane. And that double layer of serous membrane actually has a special name. That double layer of serous membrane is called a mesentery. So that is actually going to be important. So again, I'll be able to show this to you on the videos of the cadavers later. I'm not going to show them today, but basically when you open up and you start like picking out the intestines, they are all actually connected. Like if I was looking at, this is just a cross section. If I was looking at the intestine from the front, it's actually got this sheet that kind of comes down, wraps around, and goes back the other side. So the intestines are all kind of hanging off the back of the body wall by this flat sheets of, we call the mesenteries. And that's sort of the things that support the blood vessels and the nerves and stuff that are actually going to the intestines. And it also means like all of these intestines, they all are coated with slippery serous membrane. So everything is rubbing against everything else via this slippery surface. So nothing is going to rub itself badly. So this is the basic idea of mesenteries of the peritoneum. I'm going to draw this again in a little prettier way. I want to just give myself more room here. So if this is the stomach, and here's a bunch of intestines. And here's the liver, actually. There are some of these mesenteries that get special names, which you should know. So this little mesentery that is in between the liver and the stomach, it's basically like if I was looking at the stomach, like this is your stomach. It's kind of right above it. It's like right here. This is called the lesser omentum. Lesser omentum means it's still a mesentery. It's just a double layer. And then the lower part of the stomach, it actually goes down and then comes back up. And then ends up kind of surrounding lots of other things. This thing that goes down and up that hangs off the bottom of the stomach, this is called the greater omentum. This is filled with a lot of fat inside. You know, when you see somebody with like a beer belly, it's like, whoa, why are they so round? Where is that fat? A lot of that fat is actually inside the greater omentum. You know, people talk about people who are apple-shaped versus pear-shaped kind of, you know, people who are apple-shaped where their just belly is all big. It's because you've got a lot of visceral fat. You have fat inside your abdominal cavity. And again, a lot of it is within the greater omentum here. You know, as opposed to having subcutaneous fat, you know, fat under your skin in that hypodermis. So greater omentum, again, it's another mesentery. Again, lots of mesenteries that are just hanging all of your intestines off of them as well off the back wall. However, there are also organs behind the peritoneum. Like for instance, the pancreas. The pancreas is right behind the stomach. But if you lift up the stomach, you don't actually see it. This is one of the things where I wish, you know, it's kind of fun to dissect the pigs. because you dissect the pig, you pull the stomach out, and you know the pancreas is supposed to be underneath it, but it's not there. All you see is a nice shiny, membrane. And then you take your little dissecting needle and you pick away that shiny membrane, which is actually the serous membrane. And oh my God, there's a pancreas behind there. So we call this retroperitoneal. Retroperitoneal meaning behind the peritoneum. Same thing with the kidneys. You can pull all the intestines out of the way and stuff, but where are the kidneys? They're more in the lower back. The kidneys are also going to be here, retroperitoneal. So when you talk about an organ being retroperitoneal,
3 p.m.
then we mean that it's behind this serous membrane that's enveloping the majority of your digestive organs. When we get more into detail of the digestive tract, we'll see there are actually a few exceptions where parts of the duodenum poke behind the peritoneum and stuff. But in general, most of the digestive organs are wrapped in the peritoneum, but the pancreas and the kidneys and some other things are behind the peritoneum. So,
are those wrapped in a serous membrane called the retroperitoneal, or are they?
No, they're actually wrapped in adventitia, like dense connective tissue.
Oh, okay.
So things that are retroperitoneal are usually covered in dense connective tissue. And we use that word adventitia when we talked about the outer part of the blood vessels. So anything that is not enveloped in serous membrane, we usually say it's got adventitia as its outer coating. So adventitia, this is just dense CT. When we get to the kidneys, we'll see that then has got an adipose capsule. There's more going on. But so for right now, pancreas, since we want to talk about peritoneum and retroperitoneal, at some point, this is as good a time as any. Oh, so let me get a new sheet here. So the pancreas. God, I am. Slow down. So pancreas. Sometimes people say it looks kind of like a tadpole. It's retroperitoneal. Behind the stomach. And it has two jobs. So pancreas it's a classic question on an exam because it is both an endocrine and exocrine gland. So what does it mean to be an exocrine gland?
It has duct.
It has ducts, exactly. So the exocrine gland functionality is for the digestion. Pancreas delivers, I'm going to just say for right now, digestive juices, to the small intestine, via pancreatic duct. We'll talk about specifically what those juices are when we get to the digestive system, like enzymes and bicarbonate to neutralize the acidity from the stomach and stuff. So part of the pancreas is sending digestive juices via a duct to the small intestine. At the same time, it's also an endocrine gland. There are little pockets within the pancreas that make insulin and glucagon, which then get absorbed into the bloodstream and are hormones. Insulin and glucagon kind of oppose each other. Insulin is released when your blood sugar goes up, and it tells your cells to take sugar. If there's lots of sugar available, please take the sugar up. So this tells cells to take in sugar. You know, in the liver, one of the things the liver cells do, the liver takes in the sugar and it stores it as glycogen, basically starch. So your body actually has quite a bit of stored sugar in the liver, you know, in the form of this glycogen, this animal starch. So if your blood sugar is going down, then glucagon is released. This is basically going to tell liver to release, you know, stored sugar. You know, it's not actually, it basically, it's going to turn on enzymes that break down the glycogen, which then releases sugar into your bloodstream. You know, so this one, if there's a lot of sugar, it tells your cells to take it up. This one, if there's not enough sugar, it tells your body to release the stored sugar. So that's basically what the pancreas is doing. Histologically, we can talk very briefly. You know, most of the pancreas are the cells that are making the digestive juices. So most of them are making digestive juices. They're called acinar cells. However, there are pockets that are within there where you can tell the cells look a little different. Depending how it's stained, you can also see they tend to look lighter. I will show you some pictures of this a little later. So here I have what's called an islet of Langerhans. So, or sometimes it's called pancreatic islets. This makes insulin and glucagon. So most of the pancreas is just for making the digestive stuff. But you can see these little differently staining islets, little islands, the pancreatic islets of Langerhans. If you have an autoimmune disease where your body is actually attacking these, so you're not making insulin to let your cells know sugar is available, what's that disease called?
Diabetes.
Say it again. Say that one more time.
Diabetes.
It's diabetes. So, and there's actually, so that would be diabetes, the first type 1 diabetes. So there's sometimes called juvenile onset. Not juvenile onset. This is where you don't make insulin. So even if you've got sugar, the insulin is not released, so the cells don't know to take up the insulin and causes all sorts of problems. If you have this kind of diabetes, you have to like really monitor your blood sugar. As soon as your blood sugar goes up, you have to give yourself insulin shots. So you give yourself lots of shots every day. Type 2 diabetes. I should say both of these are called diabetes mellitus. There is another kind of diabetes, diabetes insipidus, that we're not going to talk about now. Diabetes, type 2 diabetes, sometimes called adult onset. This one's a little different. This one, your body's cells stop responding to insulin. Right. This one here, you don't make insulin. This one here, you're making insulin, but the cells aren't responding to it. So the effect is the same. This one tends to be more correlated with obesity or being overweight. Often you can actually make this, if you have this, it can get better if you lose weight. One of the ironic things people talk about is, this used to be juvenile onset, the one that is just the autoimmune where you attack your pancreatic islets. This one used to be adult onset. It would happen more for people, they were fine, but then as adults, they started having it. But because juvenile obesity is so prevalent now, you actually get a lot of juveniles with type 2 diabetes secondary to just being obese. So that's, it's kind of a sad state of affairs. So pancreas, again, classic question on an exam. This is one of the few glands, or is it the only gland that's like really famous as being a primary endocrine as well as a primary exocrine gland. So it's pretty cool. Pancreas. Two more glands to go, adrenals and then the gonads. So I guess that's 3 glands. So here's the kidney. Sometimes they say sitting atop the kidney, like perched atop the kidney, like a little hat. And it's the adrenal gland. It's located above the kidney, but it's not part of the kidney. It just happens to be, it's like the hat on your head is not part of your head. It's a thing that's sitting on your head. We're going to have renal arteries coming into the kidney. They're going to be adrenal arteries coming into the adrenal gland. They're their own things. It just happens to be that the adrenal gland is sitting on top of the kidney. The adrenal gland has 2 main sections. This inner section here, the adrenal medulla. This is the one that is derived from the nervous tissue, is triggered by the sympathetic nervous system. This releases epinephrine. So you've already met the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla is the part that we saw as part of the sympathetic nervous system. The other part of the adrenal gland is this outer part, which we call the adrenal cortex. You are not going to be, it actually has kind of a fun structure to it. You are not going to be responsible for recognizing adrenal cortex under the microscope. I am going to kind of briefly go through those three main layers, and kind of in the interest of time, I'm going to expedite this a little bit. So there are three layers. There's an outer layer. It's called the zona. You don't have to remember. I'm writing these names in just because I'm writing them. Zona glomerulosa, it means the zone of little balls. It's because under the microscope, it looks kind of more globby looking. This outer layer makes what we call the mineralocorticoids. Which do mineral balance. And the main one, in fact, the only one I even know by name, is called aldosterone. Aldosterone talks to your kidneys and tells you to conserve salt. So aldosterone conserves salt. I should say sodium. All right. The middle layer, which is called the zona fasciculata. I think that's what it is. Because fascicles are like little bundles, so it's kind of more like elongated looking, but again, you're not going to have to recognize it. This makes these hormones that we call the glucocorticoids. Gluco meaning sugar. The name comes from the fact that they help mobilize energy, kind of have glucose available. The main one here is called cortisol. Cortisol is also known as hydrocortisone. It's worth talking about cortisol just for a few moments. Cortisol, this is what we call a stress hormone. Cortisol is released in response to stress, and it basically shifts your body's resources to deal with a stressor. You know, you put more energy into having lots of sugar available. Your nervous system gets twitchier, so you're faster in reaction and stuff like that. The downside is it suppresses long-term maintenance, and like it suppresses immune system. You know, so you don't want it going at full blast all the time, because it's actually turning off stuff that you actually need to stay healthy in the long term, even if it's really good for dealing with the stressors in the short term. The cortisone shots, people get those all the time for inflammation, right? If you've ever had, you know, living in Marin, or if you've ever gone hiking and got a bad case of poison oak, you know, getting prednisone can just save your life. I don't know if it saves your life, but it makes it bearable. You just want to scratch your skin off and you get some prednisone, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I'm feeling okay. All that inflammatory response is gone. People who have really bad inflammation in their joints or their knees, they might get shots of cortisone and reduce the inflammation. So it can be therapeutically really useful. The downside is if you keep using it, it causes all sorts of problems. Like your connective tissue will start degenerating because you're turning off basic maintenance functions. Your nervous system starts getting frazzled if you keep it going on all the time. So in general, it's worth realizing that your stress response is helpful to deal with stressors, but in the long term, keeping it on all the time is unhealthy. So, you know, it gives you more motivation. Like, you don't want to try to not be so stressed just because it's unpleasant to be stressed, but it's bad, physically bad for you to be stressed all the time. So, and there's lots of different ways you can get stressed. You can get stressed from physical dangers. You can get stressed from social dangers, or like they've done experiments where they'll take a mouse and they'll put it into another colony's cage, but it's in its protected, it's in a little cage in the bigger cage. So none of the mice around it can like actually hurt it, but they don't like it. They're like, you don't belong in our colony. And the cortisol levels go through the roof in the poor little mouse that's been displaced and put in this colony where it's not welcome. People who've done studies find that ways you can try to minimize stress is like having some predictive ability to know when the stressor's coming. Like they'll take rats and they'll put them in a cage where, like, you know, every hour the floor is electrified. So they do. Then all of a sudden they get electrified. And if you have the electric shocks randomly, where the rat never quite knows when it's going to happen, they get really high cortisol levels. But if you have rats where they have this little, I think it's a light or a buzzer that it's like, you know, at the same time, and there's a little thing that goes on, and that they know it's coming and they're expecting it, and it's like, okay, here it comes again. Their cortisol levels are much lower, right? So I think that's part of why this, you know, kind of coronavirus stuff is particularly stressful, is people are not sure. A lot of the predictability of our lives has gotten kind of cattywampus, which is one of the things that makes it harder to not be stressed when you have stressors. So the more you can try to bring more predictability to things, the better. So cortisol. Inner layer. The zona reticularis. This makes sex hormones. You know, normally you think about your gonads, your ovaries and testes making sex hormones, but they're made different places as well, including in your adrenal glands. You know, even before you go through puberty, you've got sex hormones that are coming out of your adrenal glands. It can become particularly evident if there's some tumor of your adrenal gland where you start getting hyperproduction of some of these or something. So that's just the other part. So adrenal medulla, all this stuff we've been talking about is adrenal cortex here. So let me just double check or double. Adrenal cortex. So these three things I was talking about, said outer part, that adrenal cortex. The inner part, the adrenal medulla, is the part that makes the epinephrine. What hormone is going to talk to the adrenal cortex? And it's mostly about releasing cortisol.
ACTH.
Exactly. So, yeah, so that you've got a good memory. So we just talked about this just a little bit ago. ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone from the pituitary, is going to talk to the adrenal cortex and going to cause a release of cortisol. So where are we in time? We're okay. So that brings us finally to the ovaries and the testes. I'm going to only look at them very briefly right now, because we are going to look at them in much more detail in the reproductive system. So I'm just going to really briefly touch on them right now. You know, obviously they have two roles. One role is making the gametes. The ovaries are going to mature the eggs, the testes mature the sperm. But they also obviously are important endocrine organs. So like if we look in the testes, there are all sorts of tubules making sperm. And you've got hundreds of them. You know, there's, maybe I should, yeah. So all these little tubules, when we look at these for real under the microscope and do a cross section, it's just going to look like a cross section through a whole bunch of little tubules. In between the tubules are these little cells. They're called interstitial cells. Interstices just means the little spaces in between. These little interstitial cells, the interstitial cells of Leydig, are the ones that make testosterone. So what we're going to end, when we look at the microscope later on, you're going to see tubules making sperm and then little interstitial cells of Leydig in between. Again, what hormone is the one that will tell the cells to make testosterone?
Luteinizing hormone.
Exactly. And, oh, it's gone. So LH can also be called ICSH in a guy. And that's because it's basically interstitial cell stimulating hormone. So you can still call it LH, or because luteinizing hormone is specifically about kind of creating this corpus luteum in the woman, they decided they came up with another name in the guy. But LH is the more common way to say it. The ovaries, you have the little eggs, little ova, all over the place in the, the cortical region, the outer region, but they're never on their own. They're always surrounded by other cells. So the ovum is surrounded by other cells to create the follicles. We are going to look at follicles in much more detail later. Don't worry about it right now. You have primordial follicles where it's the egg with just a thin layer around. Primary follicles where it starts getting thicker. You end up at tertiary follicles, or is a half inch or like a half inch across and full of fluid and pop out. So there's a whole bunch we're going to talk about the follicles. The one thing I do want to say is this follicle makes estrogen. in addition to being this place that is, maturing the structure around the egg, it's also making estrogen. And after ovulation happens, again, because of corpus luteum, luteinizing hormone, this whole thing becomes what's called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum makes progesterone. After ovulation, corpus luteum, corpus luteum makes progesterone. So we're going to have both estrogen and progesterone coming from the ovaries in different amounts at different times of the cycle. We'll look at that in a whole lot more detail after we are done, or after we get to the reproductive system. So it's 3:30. Let me just show you a few really quick pictures of the histology. Let me go into the PowerPoint for this unit. Okay. So first things, just you should know where all the different glands are. And I'm gonna have to go into lab at some point before we're done and find my very favorite model, which is the little endocrine baby, which I think I showed you at once. But up here, some of the glands we're talking about are up in the head. The pituitary gland is hanging off of the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus itself is releasing hormones that control the pituitary gland. And then pineal gland, we've already talked about when we were doing the epithalamus, again, releasing melatonin. Thyroid gland, here right around the trachea. Parathyroid glands, which are little dots on the thyroid gland. Thymus gland, we talked briefly. Again, it's pretty small. Once you're into your 20s and beyond, it's pretty small. Adrenal glands, again, sitting on top of the kidneys. The pancreas looking like a goopy tadpole. And this is like kind of hermaphroditic here. Testes and ovaries. You should definitely be able to, there was a picture here. You should know that the adrenal gland, where they are, sitting on top of the kidneys. You should know that the pancreas is behind the stomach and that it's retroperitoneal, behind the peritoneum. This is kind of just, humoral stimulus. They're calling humoral. This is just different levels of things in your body can affect the release of hormones. Neural stimulus, we talked about, like the sympathetic nervous system turning on the adrenal medulla. Hormonal stimulus, tropic hormones, which we talked about a bunch, that turn on the different hormones in another gland. This is kind of showing the pituitary sitting in the sella turcica, and also showing it hanging off the bottom of the hypothalamus. Yeah, you are not going to be responsible for this, but you can. We do. Yeah, the posterior lobe, which is derived from the nervous tissue, tends to look more clear than the anterior lobe, which is a bunch of densely packed cells derived from epithelial tissue. Oh, here we have the hypophyseal portal system. Here's capillary bed number 1 in the hypothalamus, where we pick up those releasing hormones, like gonadotropin releasing hormone. Here's secondary capillary bed down in the anterior pituitary, where you are delivering those hormones to control pituitary release. This is showing how the posterior pituitary, the neurohypophysis, is actually delivering hormones that are made by these neurons up in the hypothalamus. This is actually a very pretty slide looking at the thyroid gland. So the colloid-filled follicles, these are those big empty, those big reservoirs where the colloid binds the hormone. These are these T thyrocytes, the cells that make the thyroid hormone and also make the kind of walls of these follicles. They're calling parafollicular cells. I call them C thyrocytes. Those are the ones making the calcitonin. This is kind of just showing the thyroid gland here, sitting like a little bow tie right below the larynx. Another picture showing the thyroid gland. Again, parathyroid glands looking like little dots on the rear side of the thyroid gland. This is just, you can't really see it. This magnification, the little follicles don't really look so clear, but you can kind of imagine that this is all those little reservoirs of colloid up here. But here we see parathyroid gland is a really different independent thing that just happens to be sitting in the same place. Do not worry about that. This is the adrenal gland, the cortex showing the glomerulosa fasciculata reticularis. Again, you are not responsible for this under the microscope. So it's fun to look at. I think it's kind of pretty looking at the layers, but you're not going to be responsible for that. This is a pancreatic islet of Langerhans. I might put something like this on an exam. I need to find some more pictures. This isn't a bad picture, but it doesn't give you a lot of context about the rest of the organ. But again, the islet is actually a little island of these special hormone producing cells sitting in the wider sea of acinar cells that are making the digestive juices. Oh, this is showing pituitary gigantism and pituitary dwarfism. This is kind of cool. Saying, so which hormone are you not getting enough of or getting too much of during growth if you're this dude or this dude?
Growth hormone.
Yeah, it's growth hormone. So you can see it's pretty dramatic. So this is that exophthalmosis. You're too much thyroid gland, you get this bulging of the eyes. And goiter, so this one I didn't mention, but I should mention. Goiter happens if you don't have enough iodine. So iodine is what you need to make thyroid hormone. And so if you are not making enough thyroid hormone, you have what in your pituitary gland is going to be talking to the thyroid gland saying we need more thyroid hormone?
Thyroid stimulating hormone?
Yeah, exactly. Thyroid stimulating hormone. So what happens here is the pituitary gland says, oh my God, not enough thyroid hormone. So it just keeps sending more and more thyroid stimulating hormone over. And the thyroid gland gets bigger and bigger trying to increase the production of thyroid hormone. But if there's no iodine, it doesn't matter how much thyroid tissue you've got, you can't make the thyroid hormone. So the level stays low. So the thyroid stimulating hormone keeps saying we need more. So you start getting the thyroid gland just getting bigger and bigger. And it looked, yeah, I actually had a student once who had, you could just see this thing kind of bulging under her neck like this.
question. So if a person have goiter, and
Yeah.
if they eat like salt that has iodine, can
Right.
can that get healed?
Right. So that the iodine and the salt will make it so you don't get this. Exactly. Yeah. So. Um. So I think that's all I'm going to say about the endocrine system. All right. We start, this is actually like a slice showing like white and gray matter stained orange, which is kind of pretty, but you're not going to have to recognize that. Ooh, so who can tell me what happened to this kid?
The CSF is not draining well.
Exactly. This is what happens when the CSF isn't draining well. So normally CSF is constantly getting produced and constantly draining. Definitely you want to know that whole flow from the choroid plexuses through the ventricles. We'll talk more about that. Oh, lumbar puncture. Oof. Yeah, traumatic brain injury. Avoid them. So we'll start here. You should have a sense of all the different parts of the brain and where they come from, and then also how they kind of connect. Like, thalamus, which is in the diencephalon, is below, leads up into the cerebrum, where you have more of the primary and association cortices for the senses. The brainstem down here is kind of the more basic things, like keeping your blood pressure stable and making sure you don't stop breathing and things like that. Back to him. Ventricles. We spent a lot of time. This is something that, again, is easier to see in like three-dimensional models. So if this is where this kind of complete anatomy thing actually can come in handy. Like, boot up, boot up. So when you're in it, you can, this is the main thing, the main model with the different systems, but there are also, now hold on, I'm trying to get this bar out of here because I can't see. Tag nabbit.
Mr. Eager,
Uh-huh.
for the complete anatomy, is that just the trial, or are we supposed to have the full version?
You have the full version.
Oh, because I made one and it's just it says I have 3-day trial.
Did you log in with your MyCom and with that password?
Yeah, 34D medical 20, right?
And what did you use as your account?
Student.
What's that?
I put student.
No, but did you do your MyCom email?
Yeah, I put my MyCom email.
Okay, so send me both your email, and I will try to figure that out. That's too bad that's true.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we have to get Dagnap. So I don't see I was hoping there would be a brain in here. Peripheral nerve. Let's just do the let's just do head and neck, and let's turn off the skeleton, but turn off on the nervous. Can we Oh, so maybe it doesn't. I was hoping, oh, look at that. We can take off the different layers. There's like the, oh, so this is, yeah, this is kind of cool. And if we, what if we fade that away? Yeah, so there, oh, so this is, you can fade and you can hide different parts and get down into, like, there's the lateral ventricles there. And this would be, this is a putamen, part of the lentiform. Here is going to be the caudate going around. So this is kind of showing, you can play around in here and, see what you can see. So it's, there's the optic chiasma. So I don't know how totally useful this is, but I find it fun. Here we can see the foramen of Monroe going from the lateral ventricles. Let's get rid of, hide all the stuff that is actually not the ventricles. Well, what is that? I'm wondering if it, okay. Oh yeah, so here, again, here's the, so what is this area right here where the third ventricle is draining down into? This part right here. The fourth ventricle. You should definitely know about like these little lateral apertures. Whoops, right there, the lateral apertures and the median aperture coming out the back, which is the thing that allows you to drain. Where is the CSF going to drain to? Let's turn this off. I'm getting distracted. Where does the CSF drain to once it leaves the fourth ventricle?
The subarachnoid space.
Exactly, the subarachnoid space. And from there, where does it drain to?
Jugular vein.
Not quite yet. Where does it go? From the subarachnoid space? I'm trying to get to it here.
To the space, to the granule, the arachnoid granule.
Exactly, the arachnoid granulations into these dural sinuses.
Superior sagittal sinus.
Remember, there was a superior sagittal sinus, the inferior sagittal sinus, the transverse sinus. So you should know all of those sinuses. Those could be on a test. And again, those are things that and then those will ultimately drain into your jugular vein. So we were looking at that. Again, what do we call the big dural septa, the big sheet of dura mater in between the right and left hemispheres?
Falx cerebri.
Yeah, the falx cerebri. So, and on your tests, there can be words, but on the lab practical part, it will probably be more like this. I'll try to find pictures that are clear enough and try to have things that are marked on actual either pictures or pictures of dissections. But the lab practical part won't be so much words. It will be more like pictures, to do my best to make it feel kind of like a practical. And at the same time, I could use a picture like this on a lab practical and say, I could say it wouldn't say arachnoid granulation. I could say, what is this little structure here and what is its function? And you would have to be able to pick it out in that kind of situation as well. What do we call that beautiful branching white matter inside the cerebrum? I mean, cerebellum.
Arbor vitae.
Arbor vitae. Yeah, so la 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 la. And so we did a lot about the brain. We spent quite a bit of time I think I would feel comfortable. We saw real brains. You can actually recognize it pretty well, even on pictures. What is this little tract thing going towards the front here?
Olfactory tract.
The olfactory tract. And again, it's going to be laying right on top of the ethmoid cribriform plate there. What is this thing right here?
Optic chiasma.
The optic chiasma, where you have the optic nerves come in, which is cranial nerve number what? What is the cranial nerve number for the optic nerve?
Number 2.
Number 2. I promise you there will be cranial nerve questions. We didn't talk about mammillary bodies, but I mean, they're kind of funny. They get their name partly because they look like 2 little breasts, and they actually are responsible among other things in babies for like suckling response, which is kind of fun. So you should be able to look at this. Actually, what lobe am I looking at right here?
Temporal.
That's the temporal. What of the special senses that we talked about, which special sense is in there?
Hearing.
That's hearing is in there. Definitely corpus callosum is important, being kind of the main commissure connecting the right and left. You should definitely be able to look at a picture like this, and I'm trying to look, pretty much everything here is something that we have talked about. So you should be able to look at something like this and identify it. One of the things that I put in the section, I'm pretty sure it's in the module. I'll double check. But each of these has the normal PowerPoint and then the unlabeled PowerPoint. And the reason I put those in is because then if you want, you can go into those and nothing's labeled. So then you can use both of them and you can kind of check yourself rather than look at it. And it's like when you look at it and read the label and it's like, well, I knew that. It's like, it's different. It's like when you look at it here, now it's a little trickier. Now when I say, what is this? It doesn't say, oh, it's the corpus callosum. So you have to really know it. What is this thing right here?
Pituitary gland.
That's the pituitary gland. That was the star of our show that we've just been talking about. What is this thing right here?
The pons.
That's the pons. This is kind of more advanced. What is this thing right here?
Cingulate gyrus.
That's the cingulate gyrus. Exactly, the cingulate gyrus. Which of the dural septa would I find right in between here, going between the cerebrum and the cerebellum?
Tentorium cerebelli.
That's that tentorium cerebelli in there. Exactly. So this is actually kind of pretty. Here you can really see the corpus callosum nice. What kind of membrane would normally be right here, separating the 2 lateral ventricles?
Septum pellucidum.
Yeah, exactly, the septum pellucidum. What ventricle would normally be right here?
The third.
Yeah, the 3rd ventricle. So I will have to be making up different slides for you. A lot of the pre-made slides in PAL Anatomy, if you've been taking the practice tests in there, you'll probably notice I don't know who decided it, but they decided that when they ask questions, they highlight the things and kind of obliterate the actual structure. So they'll say name this structure. And it's but I can't actually see the structure under the highlight. How can I orient myself? So I won't use those. It'll say name this structure right here. It's I can't actually see it because it's underneath. Here we have probably the thalamus. Yeah, and right in between the two thalami is where you'd find the third ventricle. Hypothalamus. From this picture, you can see the hypothalamus has lots going on. There's all sorts of nuclei in there that are involved with talking to the pituitary, involved with your sleep-wake cycling, involved with all sorts of things. You just have to think of it as the hypothalamus doing all those things we've talked about. Definitely the central sulcus with the frontal and parietal and occipital and temporal lobes. What is this little hidden lobe that you can only see if you kind of pull back this lateral fissure here?
Insula.
That's the insula. So, what is this thing that looks kind of like wet toilet paper sitting on top of the brain tissue here?
Pia mater.
So it's not pia mater.
Arachnoid?
This is the arachnoid. So the pia mater, remember pia gets its name because it faithfully follows all the little curves. So if you can see the sulci and gyri, you're probably looking at the pia mater. When you see this stuff kind of filmy that is bridging over the sulci, then you know that you're looking at the arachnoid. And normally it would be floating up a bit because it's got the CSF underneath it. But,
thank you.
Yeah, so this is going to be arachnoid because it is smooth. Like, again, pia mater follows every little nook and cranny, whereas arachnoid kind of covers over. And then the dura mater is like the really thick layer on top of all of it.
Thank you for the picture.
Sure. Again, we talked about cortex. Like a lot of the most interesting gray matter in the cerebrum is just on this thin layer, just like 7 cells thick on the surface of the brain. That's where you have all of those, visual processing and hearing processing and executive decision making and all that. Then we get down into the white matter. We talked about the homunculus, this mapping of, again, this is an example of mapping the body onto the sensory and motor cortex. We also talked about there's mapping of frequency onto in the temporal lobe and the auditory cortex, where frequencies, higher frequencies are one place, and as you go along, it's then lower and lower frequencies. Or visual space is mapped into the visual cortex, where there's kind of this correspondence between things in your visual world and how they're represented on your cortex. Talked about the different kinds of projection fibers. What were the 2 main projection tracts that we talked about that go up and then spread out along in the cerebrum?
Internal
internal capsule spreading out into the corona radiata. Those were the projection fibers. And then I want to clear. And commissures like the corpus callosum, association fibers are just kind of the ones within. Well, the other thing we can do on this slide, clear. What is this thing and this thing, this pink thing? You can see it on the other side, that the internal capsule is actually zipping up right in between.
Basal ganglia.
Those are the basal ganglia, exactly. This is going to be the caudate here and the lentiform. The lentiform, which is the putamen and globus pallidus. And here you can see the white going up the middle is going to be the internal capsule, and the gray as caudate and lentiform. Those are those deeper gray matter. What is the function of those deeper gray areas, nuclei?
Motor functions.
Yeah, they do like motor modulation. Here you can kind of see them, lentiform, caudate, and then the little amygdala. What does the amygdala do here at the tail of the caudate?
Arouses fear.
Ah! We kind of did that already. Oh, spinal cord, spinal cord is still CNS. You've got a lot of axons coming up and down, but there's reflexes happening in here. We didn't really talk about it that much, but some of the things like having the urge to pee as your bladder gets full, that happens in the spinal cord. Needing to poop when your rectum is filling out, that happens in the spinal cord. The stretch reflexes, when someone whacks your patellar tendon with a hammer and you kick out, that's happening in the spinal cord. What do we call these axons that are entering and leaving the spinal cord? Let me try to get it here. What's the word for the axons leaving and entering the spinal cord?
Ventral and dorsal roots.
Exactly, the ventral and dorsal roots. And if you look, there's kind of this little bulgy thing. It's cell bodies of our sensory neurons. What are these things that I'm circling?
Ganglia.
Yeah, and which one in particular?
Dorsal ganglion.
That's the dorsal root ganglion. What do we call the very tippy tail of the spinal cord?
Filum terminale.
The filum terminale.
The conus medullaris.
That's the conus medullaris. And then we have the filum terminale is the little thread of pia mater that then anchors us down to the very bottom. And what do we call the collection of nerves that hang below the conus medullaris, kind of like a big floppy tail?
Cauda
equina.
Yeah, the cauda equina. So we didn't actually talk about this, the cervical enlargement, but what happens? We have all these nerves, spinal nerves that originate from these cervical regions here. What structures come off of those as the nerves, spinal nerves come off? What do they start doing? What is the area of kind of interweaving nerves that come from the very top spinal nerves?
Cervical plexus.
Yeah, the cervical plexus, which had the phrenic nerve coming down to innervate the diaphragm. And then the lower cervical nerves become the brachial plexus, which are going to come down and serve your arm. So that, I mean, that's why there's more of an enlargement at the cervical region here, because there's a whole bunch of action. Once you get down to the kind of thoracic region of the spinal cord, it's just kind of serving your body in strips. But then when you get to the lumbar and sacral region, it starts getting heavy again, because that's where you have the lumbar and sacral plexuses leading to all those other nerves. Again, this would be like the filum terminale, just coming right off of the end there. Definitely you should know. I promise you there'll be pictures of spinal cords in cross section. What is this area called?
Ventral horn.
Ventral horn.
That's the ventral horn. And what kind of processing happens there?
Motor.
Yeah, it's going to be motor. And what is this area that what is all of this stuff?
White matter.
That's white matter. Those are axons that are kind of going up and down and interconnecting things. What kind of cells line this little central canal right in the middle here?
Ependymal.
Yeah, that's the ependymal cells. You know, and then normally this is the dorsal horn. The dorsal roots are the ones that form from those unipolar neurons in the dorsal root ganglion. And again, we talked about, we've got dorsal roots, you've got ventral roots, and together they're going to become what?
Spinal nerve.
Yeah, the spinal nerve. Exactly. And the spinal nerve, it's got like the ventral ramus. Those are the ventral ramuses are the ones that are going to become go to the plexuses. The dorsal ramus basically just goes along your back. Batman. Let's see. This is kind of showing the idea of motor going, ventral roots, dorsal roots. If I have my autonomic motor, they're going to start more in the lateral horns, and they're going to take a detour. And you going to have a pre-ganglionic neuron that's going to synapse in the sympathetic ganglion, and it's going to come back on. What do I call the highway that the pre-ganglionic neuron takes to get off and into the sympathetic ganglion?
Communicons.
Yeah, that's that white ramus communicans. Does anyone know what this is?
So CSF fluid.
Yeah, so this is an example of spina bifida. I should have mentioned it. So this is when you have incomplete closure of the spinal column. So the spinal cord and the dura mater can be exposed, and here we've got like an so it happens from not having enough of this B12, like I think folic acid when you're pregnant. So like there's this critical point in the beginning of development where if you don't have this vitamin, this is a common outcome. So that's where prenatal care is so important. And it happens really early. So like, even when you think you're going to get pregnant, you know, you need to be thinking about having balance, like having all the right vitamins in place, because this could happen before you even know that you're pregnant. There could be some of the malformations going on because it happens really early on in development. So I think it's folic acid is the thing that you need to make sure that you don't get all that stuff. Function, you should know like basic functions of things. You do not need to know any of this stuff. Stuff that is not on your study guide is not on the test. So none of this. You know, there are all sorts of cool things if we want to get into more detail, but not for this class. 13, 14. I'll go to the unlabeled since that actually is kind of useful. Oh, this is like a nerve. It's kind of cool looking. All right. What nerve? In fact, this is, let me get my little, turn this on and get my.
I just have a question in terms of the study guide too. There's all those sections about you should know this under the microscope. Is that still?
So if it's something that I gave you a bunch of pictures of, like that because I did upload a variety of things like the retina or the cochlea, things like that. You know, recognizing an artery versus a vein. That you do need to do. Maybe, in fact, that's a good point. That will be another on my to-do list. Histology for exam. I will send out an email trying to summarize the things that I would expect you to know. So that way it's not stressful, or at least less stressful.
All right, thanks.
All right, so wrist drop. What nerve has been damaged if somebody cannot extend their wrist? It just kind of gets held down.
The radial nerve.
Exactly, it's the radial nerve. Good. All of the extensors are innervated by the radial nerve. So if that's damaged, then those muscles are all just flaccid and the hand stays down. This one here, this is the median nerve. If the median nerve is not working, then the extensors then are actually going to pull the fingers up. I always love this, the hand of benediction. Yeah, it's like somebody's holding, it's usually like, again, like the Pope or something. I can't draw him. Now, this is a dermatome. This is actually kind of cool, but we'll talk about it. This is like in herpes and stuff like that, or shingles, you know, you can get the nerves that are just all along a single, that are innervating a single strip of you. That's where you actually see the little pustules forming, is like the little strip innervated by the particular spinal nerve that's infected. Well, this is topical. These are like iron lungs. Like when people used to get polio and then they would be like, couldn't breathe anymore, you'd have to put, this is how they would keep them ventilated. Basically by changing the pressure in and out, they would keep them breathing.
Is that their negative pressure?
Yeah, I think that's what they would do, like kind of negative and positive pressure to keep them kind of inflating and deflating. That's, yeah. So this one, you make sure you can fill out this chart. Although, yeah, you should know the overall structure. Like, you know, if this was PNS, you know, if this was motor, what are the two divisions of motor?
Somatic.
There's somatic for the voluntary, and then the autonomic for the involuntary. And what are the two sections of the autonomic?
Sympathetic, parasympathetic.
Yeah, sympathetic. And you should know the difference between those. Sympathetic, let's see if I'll get there. Oh, receptors. You know, you should know in the skin we have different tactile corpuscles, like the Meissner corpuscles. There's a deeper pressure, like the Pacinian corpuscles. You know, I would not have this under a microscope for you, but I might have it a picture like this. I don't know. these muscle spindles, this is a version of a type of proprioceptor. You do not need to recognize the cranial nerves, but you should know them. Like if I said, tell me the cranial nerves that bring messages from your special senses, you should be able to tell me. If I say, give me cranial nerves that operate the extrinsic muscles of your eye, you should tell me. So all that kind of stuff. You should have the basic understanding of the cranial nerves. Again, you do not have to look at a piece of thread coming off of the pons here and know what it is. So don't stress about that. What is this structure here?
The sympathetic.
Exactly, that's the sympathetic chain. So here's kind of the white and gray ramus communicans where the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons are making their little off-ramp and on-ramp back onto the spinal nerve. And here we have our ventral roots and we have our dorsal roots. We have our dorsal root ganglion. We have the just spinal nerve. Cervical plexus, again, only things you need to know off the cervical plexus is the phrenic nerve. Brachial plexus, you should definitely be able to recognize the different nerves, like, you know, the median nerve coming off of the M, the musculocutaneous. What kind of muscles are going to be innervated by the musculocutaneous? Biceps brachii, brachialis.
Coracobrachial.
Yeah, so you should be able to look at these nerves and recognize what they are, know where they kind of go to. And I will kind of I'll use a muscle that you know well, but I will do that as well, give you muscles that you need to, in fact, I'll do that right now just because I can.
What's the password again for that one?
I'll tell you after. Or I can here. Give me 1 second here. So here, do people see this on their screen? Is this on your screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, so it says password 3D4 medical. And you know, I'll forward this to you all after we're done with talking in another 15 minutes. So you can just kind of cut and paste and all that. And if you have any trouble with it, I will try to follow up. And I can also show you if I spazzed on the email address, I have the spreadsheet with addresses. I mailed them, so I'll give you the email address they need. All right, I was going to, so one of the things that I would do to you is, say like here, what muscle, what nerve innervates this muscle?
Obturator.
Exactly, the obturator nerve. The obturator nerve is the one that innervates these adductor muscles there. Or I could, what nerve innervates that muscle?
Femoral nerve.
The femoral nerve. Yeah, so you should be able to recognize the basic muscles. If I was looking at back here, what is the innervation for this guy on the back here?
Sciatic nerve.
Sciatic nerve, exactly. Awesome. Yeah, so that kind of stuff could show up.
I have a question about the peroneal nerve.
Yeah.
What muscles does that nerve innervate? Because I got a little confused.
So it's like the fibular nerve. Oh my God. You know, I honestly can say I'm assuming it's going to be these different ones going down your leg that are operating your feet and your ankles, but I don't know for sure.
So we won't like really be responsible for those nerves.
No, because definitely not. The ones that I talked about specifically, you should know, but the ones that we didn't talk specifically about. So here I can tell you.
I thought it was like a cancer.
Yeah, it says it goes to a little bit of the biceps femoris, and that's it. So it's and the fact is, the fibular nerve and the tibial nerve, you know, together are the sciatic nerve. So the sciatic nerve, when we say sciatic nerve, it's actually those two nerves kind of running together. So don't worry. We didn't talk about any of the things that happen further down. And we talked about sciatic nerve as basically tibial and fibular nerve together operating like the hamstrings.
Okay, thank you.
For the test on like innervations, are you going to be using that application while we're in Zoom, or?
No. The anything that since it's going to be in the Proctorio, it all has to be kind of stills that I've captured and created as questions for a test. So, yeah. Doobie-doo, doobie-doo. These are the dermatomes. Yeah, you should remember these eye muscles. Which of the eye muscles would you use to look laterally, to look off to the side? Move your eyeball to the side.
Lateral rectus.
Yeah, lateral rectus. And which of the cranial nerves would operate it?
Abducens.
That would be the abducens, cranial nerve 6. So you want to, and the other, you can actually, those other muscles, the like the superior oblique actually does make you kind of look off to the side and down. So you could actually, a right answer would also be, you know, superior oblique, which is driven by like the trochlear nerve. So there's actually more answers than one to that. You do not need to know all the details like this at all. The ear, no, discard. So we've got another couple of minutes here. Let's keep moving. Moving. 15, autonomic, unlabeled. This will go quick. Ooh. This is just kind of showing if you are looking at somatic motor. Somatic motor is just going to be one shot. Motor neuron starts in the CNS, goes all the way and reaches and innervates the muscle and releases what kind of neurotransmitter?
Acetylcholine.
Acetylcholine. And when you are in the autonomic, you have one neuron that goes, synapses in the ganglion, and the second neuron continues to the organ. Of these two, which one is the sympathetic? Which one is the parasympathetic?
The middle one is sympathetic.
Yeah, so this is going to be sympathetic because we've got the middle, the thoracolumbar outflow. We've got, oh, there, here, this one. This is thoracolumbar outflow. We've got like a short first neuron, a long second neuron, parasympathetic starting from the cranial or sacral regions, really long initial one, then a short little one. And what nerve actually is that first one there? Oh, I just disappeared it. What is this one? Shoot. Not sure why it's not. So this would be like the vagus nerve, right? It's the only of the cranial nerves that goes out of the head. So this has got to be the vagus nerve. Again, we've got the parasympathetic. This is sympathetic chain going up and down along the spine. What do we call this collection of vessels right here?
Sympathetic chain.
Those are the blood vessels that I'm looking at here.
The blood vessels, so that's the celiac trunk?
That's the celiac trunk, exactly. What is this blood vessel down here?
Can't see.
I'm trying to get, I'm not sure why it's not letting me, well, let me get out. Oh, it's because it's enable editing was off. I was like frustrated because it was not letting me actually write on it. Okay, now I can write on it. I can say, come on. Oh, come on. There we go. Now we're there. All right. Right here. What is this right there?
Common iliac.
External iliac.
So it's going to be the external iliac, because if you look here, common iliac is the one that's right coming off of the bottom of the abdominal aorta. And then we can actually see, like, oh my God, there's the internal iliac coming off. So that means we must be in the external iliac here. What muscle is this?
Psoas.
Yeah, this is psoas major and this is iliacus. So iliopsoas is the whole thing. So this is kind of showing that whole white ramus and gray ramus, and yeah, let's move on. If we go to so the tongue, did anybody actually look in the mirror or look down if there's anybody you're sheltering in place with, kind of look down in the back of have them stick out their tongue and try to find the circumvallate papillae? Did anybody actually see these? Yes, no?
I totally forgot to look in here.
Hard to see it.
They're worth looking for. They're really trippy. It's like if you didn't know you had them, you're gonna like, holy crap, I just lived my whole life with these big honking knobs on the back of my tongue that I never even realized were there. I remember the first time I saw them, I was like, it was just kind of surreal. It's like, what? That's real? It was like very strange. Taste buds, you should be able to recognize under the microscope. You know, back to Sari's question. I think it was Sari. You know, here on the circumvolate papilla, kind of going down in the little groove. You know, again, this, I do have slides that I uploaded onto the module, you know, that look a lot like this, but kind of in the larger context of the entire papilla. What kind of tissue is actually lining the outside of the tongue here?
Stratified squamous.
Exactly, stratified squamous epithelium. Which cranial nerves are bringing sense of taste from the anterior part of the tongue?
It's the facial.
That's facial. And what about the rear part of the tongue?
It's the glossopharyngeal.
Glossopharyngeal. So that kind of stuff you should know. So it's 5. I mean, I can keep talking for a bit, or we can just, I'm not sure what makes the most sense right now. Do people have a sense? I know that people have lives out here.
I would like to keep going.
Okay. So I will say I'm going to keep going, but don't feel that you need to stay here. But I will, for those people who have time, and I'm recording this, so if it's, I know I'm kind of meandery, but if it's useful, it will be up on YouTube as well. So if you're not here right now, you can look at whatever we're talking about.
Quickly.
Yes, Casey?
Sorry if you already answered this, but is the Proctorio, it'll be free response and multiple choice?
Yes. Yeah, so some of it will be essay questions. Like there was an essay question that I put on the one we just did even.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, so I usually have, somewhere around like 50-50 or so of like multiple choice versus short answer, although it'll depend. I'll have to see what it's like writing the exam in this thing.
Thank you.
Oh, what is this thing right here?
Lacrimal gland.
The lacrimal gland. And what is this thing over here?
Lacrimal sac.
Lacrimal sac, right? Well, it sounds like someone's got like a bird going. So the little ducks, is that, Jamba, do you have a bird?
Yes. Okay.
Cool.
It's gone.
That's okay.
Oh, it's coming.
Here we got the eye. Oh, so the eye. We did have a chance to dissect the eye. What is this goop in the middle of the eye that you got to see?
Vitreous.
The vitreous humor. It kind of making me sad. Think that was the last day we were all actually doing something. It was like dissecting the eyeball. What is this thing right here?
The lens?
The lens? What is this part right here?
Cornea.
The cornea. So the cornea, which is that clear window part of the fibrous tunic. So you should know the layers of the eye. What is this part right here?
Ciliary bodies. Iris.
It would be the ciliary body would be up
Iris.
here. Yeah, so this is the iris, which is also part of the vascular tunic. Well, this is kind of, what is that little hole there at the junction of the cornea and the iris?
Chilem.
That's that canal of Schlemm. That's the thing that's draining the aqueous humor. Which nerve number is this?
2.
Cranial nerve number 2, optic nerve. You should be able to recognize the retina under the microscope or in a photomicrograph. It's a classic one. There's the basically the rods and cones, the bipolar cells, the ganglion cells. This is showing that flow. Ciliary bodies are making that aqueous humor, which then drains into the canal of Schlemm. The ear, you should know the basics of the ear. You know, you've got sound coming in, vibrates the eardrum, which then through the little ossicles pushes and pulls on that little oval window. The oval window then sets the little waves in motion in the fluid-filled world of the inner ear. In the inner ear, we've got the cochlea, which is the thing that's actually going to be doing the sensory transduction for sound. The other things we have in the inner ear are the semicircular canals doing the dynamic equilibrium, and then the saccule and the utricle and the vestibule. So saccule and utricle and semicircular canals have this vestibular nerve. Cochlea has the cochlear nerve, and together these are going to be cranial nerve number what?
Number 8.
Exactly, cranial nerve 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve. And what is this thing? This little
pharyngotympanic duct.
Pharyngotympanic duct or tube, or it could be the eustachian tube or the auditory tube, but it's helping equalize the air pressure in the inner ear and the outside. Here is the inner ear. This is kind of showing the cochlea and showing the saccule and the utricle and the little crista ampullaris of the semicircular canals. You should be able to recognize the different ducts of the cochlea. There is this vestibular duct where the vibration enters, the tympanic duct where the vibration is returning back to the round window, and then the middle part, the cochlear duct that has the organ of Corti, that has the little hair cells. And the hair cells are the actual things that bend and convert the movement and vibration into an electrical signal. That's kind of the classic. And this basilar membrane that the organ of Corti is sitting on top of, that has different mechanical properties. So high frequency sounds are going to vibrate it closer to where the sound is entering. Low frequency sounds are going to be going much higher, closer to the helicotrema, the tip end of the snail. So kind of higher frequencies are here, low frequencies are going to vibrate it down here. This is kind of showing how the saccule and the utricle work. Basically, you have hair cells. Macula just means a little spot, a patch of hair cells. They have these otoliths, these little calcium carbonate stones on top. So as you bend your head with respect to gravity, the gravity pulls on the stones bend the hair cells, and makes an electrical signal so your brain knows that your head is changing direction with respect to gravity. So again, this would be both the saccule and the utricle. They're basically the same thing, just with different orientations. Semicircular canals are detecting this dynamic equilibrium, rotational. You know, as you spin, the fluid has inertia and doesn't move, and as you do, the fluid ends up pushing, bending this cupula, this little gelatinous thing, bending the hair cells, which then make an electrical signal that tell your brain that you're spinning. It's kind of okay. So the next time, I mean, the next ones are already now getting into the cardiovascular. So I don't know if it's worth going back over that because that's more recent. Definitely, you know, and on the new things I made for Pearson, it goes over the vessels and the blood. So let's talk about the heart briefly. You should know the basic circuits. You know, you've got, you know, the main systemic circuit going off to all of your body, pulmonary circuit going to the lungs, pulmonary circuit, which is much shorter or needs less pressure to keep the blood flowing because there's not as many blood vessels it has to sustain. You know, the heart here in its little pericardial sac. What vein is this right here coming in on the top of the heart?
Supravena cava.
Yep, exactly. Then what is this and this?
Brachiocephalic.
Those are
vein.
brachiocephalic veins, and then going into the subclavian and jugular vein. Here's the aorta coming off. What's the first main branch coming off the aorta?
Brachiocephalic.
Exactly, the brachiocephalic trunk. Exactly. What is this? That little doohickey left over there between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta.
Ductus arteriosus.
Yeah. So that is, it used to be the ductus arteriosus, but once you're grown up and it just turns into this vestigial connective, it's going to be the ligamentum arteriosum. But you're totally got the right track. So it's what used to be the ductus arteriosus in the fetus. You know, you should definitely be able to look at a heart like this and recognize the main, what vessel is that?
Left subclavian.
Yeah, exactly. That's going to be the left subclavian. It's going to be the left common carotid, and this is that brachiocephalic. What is this structure that's visible right here inside this tube?
Pulmonary trunk.
So we're in the pulmonary trunk. And so that
valve, semilunar valve.
That's the pulmonary semilunar valve. Yeah, good.
Valve.
And what chamber am I in here?
Left ventricle.
Yeah, it's going to be the left ventricle. And again, I know I'm in the left ventricle for a number of reasons, but partly because it's got such thick walls. We can see the right ventricle here feeding into the pulmonary trunk's got much thinner walls. What is this thing?
Chordae tendineae. Oh, the papillary muscle.
Yeah, the papillary muscle, which is then anchored onto the chordae tendineae, which are supporting the little valve flaps for the AV valves. Yeah, awesome. What is this weird ear-like thing here? There's one over here as well.
Left and right auricle.
Yeah, the auricles. What are these vessels here kind of coming right off of the aorta?
These are sinuses.
Coronary arteries?
The coronary arteries.
Those are the coronary, the right and left coronary arteries. So this would be the left. That's kind of a cool shot. What chamber am I in here?
Right ventricle.
That's the right ventricle. So, I would feel okay like asking you a question like that. You should be able to look at this and kind of orient yourself and realize, oh, here's one chamber with really thick walls. Here's one with really thin walls. And oh, here's these valves, valve flaps. So this got to be the entrance to the right atrium and the left atrium. You should know the conduction system of the heart, SA node, pacemaker, intranodal pathway after a 1/10 or 2/10 of a second, then going down the AV bundle, also known as the bundle of His. I just like the bundle of His because it sounds like it's a snake. Then the bundle branches, and into the Purkinje fibers, just kind of sending that electrical excitation all over. These things conducting the electricity are actually, they're kind of modified cardiac muscle cells that have very little kind of actin and myosin. They're more optimized just to conduct electrical signals. We didn't do this in this class. This is just as the cardiac muscle gets excited, it makes these electrical signals, the P, the QRS, T. This is just kind of showing the coronary arteries. I didn't really talk about the drainage. The main thing is the coronary sinus is where all the coronary circulation ultimately drains into, which then just dumps back into the right atrium. This is trippy. You're not responsible for this at all, but this is just showing the development of the heart, because the heart has this really crazy thing where it starts beating like really like within weeks after, as soon as you become a ball of cells that's too big just for diffusion to keep everything okay, you need to have some crude circulatory system. So the heart starts beating and keeping blood flowing and keeping the tissues with oxygen and nutrients. But while it's beating, it's got to develop. So all of this development happens while it's still pumping your blood. It's just kind of mind-blowing to me. It's gonna, again, the last week of class, we're gonna talk a little more about development. The idea that there was an egg and there was a sperm. The sperm is much smaller than that. And you were one cell, and then you became trillions of cells that are you. And it's kind of mind-blowing to think about that process. It's kind of crazy that it actually works. So I'd say the vessels, the vessels we've talked about really recently. Vessels also you can review in the Pearson, the mastering thing. Basically, you should remember the main types of vessels, definitely where all the vessels are. You should be able to recognize in a photomicrograph an artery versus a vein. We can just, maybe that will be kind of the last thing. How do we know for sure I'm in an artery versus a vein?
The thick walls.
Which one has thick walls?
Artery.
Yeah, the artery is going to have much thicker walls, and the vein will have thinner, and in particular the walls, like the tunica media, the part that has all the smooth muscle in it. But I think, I'm trying to find here it is. I think it probably makes sense to kind of call it a day. If you have specific questions about anything, I'm happy to answer them. Does anyone have any particular questions they'd like me to go over before we kind of tie off for the weekend?
I just had one question. I was doing the general and special senses page in the syllabus, and it asks what is adaptation, and I didn't have anything in my notes for that.
Oh, okay. Maybe I didn't mention it. I'll just mention it now. Adaptation is when the sense will stop responding to a constant stimulus. So like, you know, when you put your clothes on, you could feel the material against your skin. And then pretty soon you didn't really think about stuff touching your skin all over your body, even though it's still there. Because those touch receptors kind of wake up when something happens, but then they kind of stop responding. If you put your hair in a ponytail, you can feel it getting pulled back, but then for the rest of the day, you're not feeling your hair unless you've like overdone it. You know, you don't feel it. You know, the hairs bend, you get a message that they're bending, but then they stop responding. There's so many senses that are detecting so much information all the time. So if you were actually aware of everything all the time, all at once, it would be absolutely overwhelming. So in general, your senses tend to wake up if there's some kind of a change, and then you can attend to it and decide what to do. But then if the stimulus just stays there, you kind of stop noticing it. The only things that don't adapt in general are things like pain, which is detecting tissue damage. Like in general, you don't want to stop experiencing pain. Some of those proprioception and stuff like that, where you need to kind of keep or balance stuff, where you need to keep knowing which direction is gravity. But in general, most senses will just stop responding after a while, and that's called adaptation. It's kind of like the classic, the frog, you put them in the water, and or if you're in your room right now and the temperature feels normal, you probably aren't aware if it's warm or cold. But when you first walk into a new room, you probably notice, is it warmer or colder than the room you were in before? So that's adaptation.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions before we bid the adieu? All right.
I just was wondering the great saphenous. You said when they do the coronary bypass, so they take it from greater saphenous vein. It works the artery because it's coronary artery. How they put it.
Yeah, I think for whatever reason, and I know it's got a slightly different structure in general, but you know, it's a tube that's part of your tissue. It's a blood vessel, and it seems to work well to help reroute the blood flow to make sure the heart has enough blood. You know, you'd have to talk to a cardiac surgeon to get more details there, but I do know that that is one of the vessels, a common vessel that they harvest to do those kind of operations. So, but beyond that, it's definitely not my area of expertise. So, cool.
Thank you for doing the review.
No worries. And I will plan on sending out some kind of a histology thing for you too, so you can have a sense of which things you actually should think about being responsible for and which ones you don't have to think about. And again, if you have questions, let me know. And I might reach out to you if you were someone who had issues with the Proctorio, since we still have like 4 or 5 days, and I want to just make sure that all that is debugged before we get into the prime time.
And one more question, last one. So the vaccination, is it also temporary? The vaccination and passive vaccination, is it the same?
No. So a vaccine gives you what's called active immunity. So if you use a vaccine, then your body actually creates the antibodies on its own, and it makes, again, for this class, you don't need to know this, but it makes memory cells, and those memory cells stay with you. So if your body ever sees the same pathogen again, you'll be able to recognize it and fight it. Whereas, like, you know, passive immunity is Just you temporarily get some antibodies, but when they're gone, they're gone. But vaccines, one of the great things about vaccines is they give you long-term memory. So you stay protected for a long, long time.
So that's part of a T cell.
T cells and B cells, yeah. You know, in this class, we don't do that. In physiology or in micro, you spend a lot more time looking at those. But yeah, it's the B cells and the T cells. They both make memory cells. And once you've been exposed to some pathogen, if you ever see it, your body encounters it again, they wake up and do a really strong, fast defensive response. So you end up knocking it down before it ever has a chance to make you sick. So, yeah, so the basic way it works is like the first time the pathogen gets into your body, like it's coming to you and it's like it gets in, you get sick, and your body has to make a response, make all the antibodies, make all the special cells that are going to be the army to fight it. It takes a while. And by the time your body is doing that, this thing is dividing and you're sick and you're like lying in bed. And finally, your body defenses come online and then you hit it back. Now you've gotten better. But in that process, you've made memory cells. And now those are just lying in wait. And they have the template that makes that they'll recognize that thing if it ever shows up again. So now this thing's coming in. And immediately the memory cells can ramp up this fast, super strong response. And you just knock it out before it ever has a chance to make you sick. That's kind of how vaccines work. Or actually immunity from just having gotten sick and gotten better on your own. So anyway. So I guess I will wish you all have a good weekend and yeah.
Yeah, same to you. Thank you, Dr. Egan.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.
Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
You're welcome. Bye-bye then.